I want to talk to you today about the vaccine lie and why it's so easy to believe the lie. The idea of artificial immunization started over 1100 years ago in China. They took dried pus from smallpox scabs and blew it into the nostrils of people to infect them with the smallpox virus to make them immune. Now, this actually made sense because they were allowing the entire variola virus to cross the respiratory epithelial barrier up here in the nose, which gives mucosal protection of future infections. And that was called variolation. Where we made our fatal mistake was injecting stuff into people that causes an inflammatory immune response, bypassing the epithelial barrier with a needle, and we've been doing it ever since. That was called a vaccine, and that does not provide protection of infection. So why do we keep doing something that does not work? Well, because a very convenient two-part lie got started. Here is the first part of the lie. Injecting something into your body creates these different shaped antibodies that will protect you against infection. Now, here is Dr. Deborah Birx, who served as the White House Coronavirus Response Coordinator under President Trump from 2020 to 2021, admitting the first lie, that the shot prevents infections.
I knew these vaccines were not going to protect against infection, and I think we overplayed the vaccines. 50% of the people who died from the Omicron surge were older, vaccinated.
The truth is, all shots called vaccines do not prevent infections. Childhood shots, flu shots, COVID shots, all of them. So you've been lied to for decades. And yeah, these are all the shots the CDC recommends for your child. The reason they cannot prevent infections is because they are designed to create serum antibodies that are always inside of you. They are on the wrong side of the epithelial barrier, or fence, as I like to call it. The epithelial fence separates the inside of you here from the outside of you here. Anything that can stop a virus, a bacteria, or toxin from getting through the fence will protect you from infection. But these serum antibodies that are always inside of you, they can't do that. Now, most of the antibodies are found in the blood vessels here and in the lymph fluids here. And some are also in the interstitial fluids between your cells and tissues right here. Those serum antibodies cannot stop an infection from happening. They can only react to an infection when it does happen. So here's how antibodies react to infections. Notice that they are all shaped like the letter Y. The Y part will grab onto the antigen or virus like this, and the tails of the Ys will change shape and they remain exposed. This blocks the viruses from getting into other cells and marks them for destruction by your immune cells. So what happens is your immune cells, like this macrophage, will then attach to the tail of the Y. This allows the macrophage to pull in the entire antigen-antibody complex and destroy it. It's your immune cells that eliminate the invaders, not the antibodies. Antibodies are just non-living proteins with no intelligence. Your living immune cells have the intelligence, and they do all the work. However, there is one type of antibody that can prevent an infection, and that is called a mucosal secretory IgA antibody. These are secreted from the inside of you to the outside of you after something crosses from the outside to the inside through that epithelial barrier, kind of like that smallpox variolation thing that we talked about earlier. Once these specialized B cells then, called plasma cells, have been trained after a natural infection, they will release these secretory IgA antibodies here that are taken in by the epithelial cell and released on the other side back into the mucus to protect you from future infections. IgA antibodies do not have exposed tails because they do not attach to your immune cells, as you saw in the previous slide. They are designed to block invaders on the outside of you so they can't get in. If they did start attaching to your immune cells, your epithelial barrier would be constantly inflamed, and we don't want that. You can also get mucosal IgA antibodies through oral vaccine products like the oral live polio vaccine and the oral live rotavirus vaccine because they do allow the whole virus to cross the epithelial barrier from the outside to the inside. Again, anything that can stop an invader from getting through that barrier will protect you from infection. The mucosal antibody can do that. But shots will only create serum antibodies, including serum IgA, that are always inside of you. Shots do not result in mucosal IgA that end up out here. Therefore, they cannot prevent infections. This is why you will see a shift from injections to aerosolized inhalation products and ingested products, thinking that this will stimulate mucosal secretory IgA. They will try this with the mRNA platform, but it won't work because it's a lipid nanoparticle vector that's crossing the barrier, not the actual virus. Any mucosal IgA that results will be targeted against the part of the virus that constantly mutates, so this idea will ultimately fail. So here's the second part of the lie, that shots called vaccines prevent you from spreading infections. And here's Fauci admitting that that was a lie.
The ability of individuals who are infected through breakthrough infections, namely vaccinated people who ultimately get infected, it is clear that they are capable of transmitting the infection to uninfected individuals.
The reason people who get the shot get what Fauci calls breakthrough infections is because the protection of infection is cellular and does not involve serum antibodies. This involves specialized immune cells that guard that epithelial barrier. They can detect viruses that get into the cells that make up the epithelial barrier. And when they see that happening, they destroy the cells with the viruses in them before the virus gets copied and released inside of you. The epithelial cell gets replaced, and that is protection of infection. Very simply put, we now know that getting the mRNA COVID shot will reduce the numbers of those protective cells. This was very easy to prove just by counting them before and after the shot, and this has been done many times in peer-reviewed scientific journals. The less of those cells you have, the less protection you have against infection. We also know that those cells use receptors called toll-like receptors that help them determine when viral genetic material is inside of those cells. The shot also diminishes the functionality of those toll-like receptors. So some immune cells that do remain are not able to detect cells on that epithelial barrier that have viruses in them. This is one reason why people who keep insisting on getting these shots will continue to get infected. Worse, those immune cells and their toll-like receptors are also responsible for detecting and eliminating cancer cells. This explains why we are now seeing an escalation of what they call turbo cancers, because they take off at turbo speeds. So the people like Fauci say, well, that's okay that it won't protect you against infection or stop it from spreading, because the infection will be less severe. Well, let me tell you how dangerous that line of thinking is. When you keep injecting the population with a product that allows infections to take place over and over again, you never get to herd immunity. Herd immunity can only happen when enough of the population has the ability to not get infected, That protection of infection is cellular and cannot come from shots, only from natural infections that come through that barrier from the outside to the inside. So do not fear natural infections. They are all treatable and manageable, even the really scary ones like Ebola or rabies. Incredible as it may seem, there are unvaccinated people walking around right now who have antibodies against rabies and had no idea that they were even exposed to the rabies virus. You can read about that right here. So rabies is like any other viral illness. Not everyone who is exposed will develop severe symptoms. So how do you treat someone with symptoms? Well, you certainly don't inject them with something to make antibodies because they've already been injected by the bite or the scratch of the rabid animal. And it can sometimes take weeks to make antibodies. And if a person with weakened immunity is developing severe symptoms while they are making their own antibodies, injecting something into them to try to make more antibodies is not going to help. So what you do is you take rabies antibodies that were produced elsewhere and you put them in the person that has developed severe symptoms before they could make their own. The antibodies will block the virus from infecting more cells and mark the virus for destruction by the cells of the immune system. So if you were paying attention, you saw this happen with COVID. Many people who had severe COVID symptoms were miraculously saved by the introduction of monoclonal antibodies. And this is the reasoning behind how the vaccine lie perpetuates. If antibodies are that super powerful, why don't we just inject everyone with something to make their own antibodies before they get infected? Well, because unless you inject the whole virus, the antibodies will be suboptimal and can make the symptoms of the disease even worse. And that's called antibody-dependent enhancement. And I explained that in depth at this Substack article right here. So the danger with injecting whole viruses is you cannot reliably control the strengths of the batches that get distributed. So what happens is you risk putting something into people that is so potent that it overwhelms the immune system and ends up causing a severe case of the disease or even death. And this has happened in the past with live vaccines like oral polio. Ask Bill Gates about that. It's also happened with the yellow fever shot. So pilots at major airlines that mandate the yellow fever shot as a condition of employment, be aware of the risk. So vaccine manufacturers say, okay, well, it's too dangerous to inject whole viruses, so let's weaken the virus and inject that. Or just inject part of it. Or even better, messenger RNA with a message to make just part of it so that your experience with the infection will be less severe. Sounds good, right? Well, that's not working out with the mRNA shots, and the COVID mRNA shot taught us exactly that. The more shots you get, the more likely you are to develop more severe symptoms. And why is that? It happens because besides antibody-dependent enhancement, another reason is something called antibody class switching that occurs after booster shots. As I mentioned, these antibodies can be a good thing, but if you get too many of them or the wrong type at the wrong time, they can hurt you. Simply put, there are 5 types of antibodies that can be remembered with the acronym GAMED. And further, there are several subclasses of the G antibody. We now know that after repeated shots that try to boost up the numbers of antibodies floating around, there is a shift to an overabundance of G subclass 4. And when this happens, the antibodies no longer bind to the spike protein. The spike proteins that are created by subsequent shots just float around free without antibodies attached to them. So the antibodies that you have from previous shots, you see, are supposed to attach to the spike protein created by the subsequent shot. But that doesn't happen with this IG4 shift. So what happens to these unbound spike proteins? Well, they attach to these receptors all along your vascular system. And when this happens, the cells of your immune system, not antibodies, your immune cells like this one, will vigorously attack the cells with the spike protein attached and will destroy them and sometimes destroy normal healthy cells nearby. When this happens in the heart specifically, you end up with myocarditis, and this is exactly what we are seeing after booster shots in some people, even children, and it can be deadly. So people who insist on doing this to themselves or to their children, thinking that shots will protect them, they need a checkup from the neck up because they are just not thinking clearly. And if someone mandates it as a condition of employment, or to travel by boat or air, or go to a ball game or a restaurant or school, or walk into any place of business, do not comply. If you would like to learn more about how the immune system works, consider taking my 4-module course available here. Thanks for watching, and thanks for staying smart.